All right. It's Monday of free agency week. And with you today is Thomas Dimitrov, CEO of Sumer Sports. I'm Eric Eager, one of the VPs at Sumer Sports. Wow. What a day. We've had a ton of things happen. We just saw, coming through the ledger, just a few, signings just in the last 10 minutes. Jamel Dean goes back to Thomas, your division rival, Tampa Bay. That was a real big surprise. Patrick Peterson, another corner, signs with the Pittsburgh Steelers. We had Tremaine Edmonds, a linebacker, go to Chicago for a top of market deal. And we've had Jawan Taylor, the Kansas City Chiefs, as we talked about, told Orlando Brown to go fly a kite. They go get Jawan Taylor, a tackle from Jacksonville, just 25 years old. A number of other signings as well. Thomas, how's it been going there? I see you're at the Atlanta offices where we're going to be in a couple days. What has this first day been like for you?
Well, I was sitting here with Chase Falavine, the head of cap and contracts with us, and we were watching like we used to watch at the Atlanta Falcons. Had the big TV on here, been watching all day, looking at, watching the rumors early on. It's busy. I can't wait to really dig into all this on on Wednesday, but we're going to be leading up over the next couple days. It's been fun to watch. I mean, look, everyone's hanging on the edge of their seat to see where Aaron Rodgers is going, and we are as well. But, some of these other signings that you just suggested are really important signings for these teams. As everyone knows, they're not just like pitiful and push them aside. You, as a GM, you get on the phone with your owner, you're tweeting them right away as soon as you do a deal, and you want that owner to give you a nice pat on the back, right? Our owner and Arthur Blank, again, everyone needs to know this. He was so good about putting the money out, Eric. I used to take a beating for being the guy who was spending our money. I mean, Arthur Blank loved to spend on the media and not the media, I shouldn't say that, on the fan base. So we would go out there and look for people. We weren't ones that were always trying to save money, of course. We were looking to bring in free agents. And that's what today is with some owners. Other owners like their people to really sit back and not do any of these first week deals or 2-week deals.
Yeah, for sure. And we're going to focus more tomorrow on some of the deals, and we're going to try to get some data in front of you and everything. And then, of course, Wednesday, I will be in the Atlanta office. Thomas will be sitting in his Eames chair. I will be in a chair more reflective of commoners. But we will be talking about these things live, and it'll be great because it's always just fun to sit there and riff about football with you. I can't wait for that. We've had, we're going to continue to talk about quarterbacks a little bit. Last week's episode on Wednesday was our most viewed and most listened to show that we've ever had through the podcast stream. People like talking about quarterbacks. And so we're going to talk there. We've actually just had a couple signings, actually a few signings at the position that have come through. Sam Darnold, the former third overall pick of the New York Jets, is signed with the San Francisco 49ers, which is an interesting one as a possible complement to Brock Purdy. And then speaking of former 49ers, Jimmy Garoppolo signed what is a kind of a mid-market deal with the Las Vegas Raiders. So Jimmy G, the square jaw, the good looks, all going to Las Vegas to possibly be the most eligible bachelor in the Sin City for the Raiders. But we had a couple actual trades this weekend, right? So we first had on Friday the Carolina Panthers, owners of the 9th pick, right? And we've talked about this before. The Panthers, with Frank Reich at the helm, has taken some of his folks over from Indianapolis, has taken people like Ejiro Evero from Denver over there. They're building like a mega staff. They have with Fitterer as the GM and Tepper as the owner, they really look like they kind of are starting to get their stuff together. They go and they take the 9th pick, the 61st pick, a first rounder next year, a second rounder 2 years from now, and DJ Moore, one of the best wide receivers in the NFL, in my opinion. And they go up with Ryan Poles and take the number 1 pick. The Bears get all of that bounty back. They are definitively building around Justin Fields, at least for one more year. Thomas, what do you think about that? What do you think about that move? When you saw it go through, what were your first thoughts?
Well, what I normally do, and what I think a lot of people will do, is they'll take Ryan Poles versus Scott Fitterer, right? They'll take the general managers and they'll look at this move. I think we could do that quickly or not so quickly. I would love to talk about Ryan Poles and the approach there at Chicago. You and I can riff on that a little bit? And then if we jump over to our buddy Scott
Yeah.
Fitterer and that group, because they're completely different, right? Here's Ryan Poles going into his second year as a general manager, finishing at the number 1 slot in the league. That's not an easy place to be. Massive amounts of pressure and also massive amounts of control. He's the power broker of the draft, right? At least he was. He goes in here and he brokers a deal with Scott Fitterer and the Carolina Panthers. And the first couple of things I want to talk about is, one, let's call it the way it is. You have a quarterback there that people were talking about trading, which was nonsense in the end. And no offense if any, I can't even remember where your stance was on it. You were playing. We were playing back and forth on it a little bit, but all I would say is this is great for the organization. This is great for the quarterback himself. Number one, it's great for the coaching staff. It's great for the fan base because everyone realizes, let's put that to rest. Let's focus on the quarterback we have and let's help him grow. Let's bring in DJ Moore, a really, a good, solid, I would say top 12 to 15. Yeah. I don't know if he's a top 10 or 8. But what he is, and we've been talking about this, he's not only a deep threat that, we're sitting there thinking about Fields and what Justin Fields needs to do. He needs to have a guy underneath along with Claypool. And I think that's what you're going to get with DJ Moore, right? Get another guy underneath. So you have those two. And now you can start focusing free agency in the draft on O-line, tight end. And I think that's what's going to happen here. I just think it opens up a world of opportunity. And if I can, and then I want to toss it to you, the idea of being a general manager, when you go in and you can check some of those boxes in free agency before you get into the uncertainty of a draft, that was something that always made me feel settled, right? And they've done that already. And I think, the draft is going to be a really interesting goldmine for them if they do it right.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because ultimately you end up with all of that cap space in large part because the guy before you either didn't have the picks or didn't hit on the picks, right? And so the one guy that they did hit on in 2018 was Roquan Smith. They couldn't get a deal done, so they trade him to the Ravens. But 2017 you had Mitch Trubisky. That was a trade up. Just one pick, but a trade up, and he doesn't hit. And then you trade 2 first rounders for Khalil Mack. And Khalil's no longer on the team. And so you have this real chasm in your roster because you didn't, buy into young players who are going to be expensive for you if they hit. And then the ones that you did, draft didn't hit. So you got all this money. And so that's like the one side of the money part which it's rough. You actually have to go in and build those aspects of your roster. Now, what we said at the Super Bowl, and I was somebody that said they should at least think about trading Justin Fields because there could have been a situation where they like one of the quarterbacks more. You have a longer window. That ended up not being the case. I think Bryce Young's maybe a little bit too small for a lot of people in the league, and CJ Stroud maybe doesn't have the ceiling athletically that a lot of people, and then Anthony Richardson and Will Levis are far more projects. Additionally, Caleb Williams is a guy that if Justin Fields were to struggle, now you have your first round pick next year. You have Carolina's first round pick next year. You have 2 seconds as well. You can move up and get him if Fields weren't to work out. So I think it does hedge the bets a little bit. But now you look at it, Thomas, I want to get your opinion here because you talk about free agency. And the thing about free agency is it's not going to net you premium positions, right? You're not, if you want to go out and get a tackle, you're going to have to do what the Chiefs did and get a project like Jawan Williams for $20 million a year. That's expensive. Orlando Brown's going to command $20 to $22 million a year, and he's an average tackle. Wide receiver, similar. There isn't a wide receiver worth a top-end deal, but last year, Christian Kirk got $20 million a year from Jacksonville. Same thing with corner, same thing with, so what do? They go out and get 2 linebackers, right? Non-premium positions, guys that, there isn't a Tremaine Edmonds of tackles in this draft, right? Non-premium positions are available this time of year. Nate Davis is a guard from Tennessee who had struggled early, had evolved. They got him at guard. I think that when you go through free agency, now they're taking the non-premiums, right? They used a draft pick to get DJ Moore, right? That's a premium position. They're going to have to figure out tackle. They're going to have to figure out corner. They're going to have to figure out some of the defensive end, some of the premium positions. But at least right now, they're going in and getting sort of up the middle players, which aren't as valuable, but they are more plentiful in free agency.
And this has to do with the idea of setting up your scenarios, right? and realizing you as a GM and a head coach, you sit together as, again, team builders, and you say, all right, what's out there in the draft, what's out there in free agency, and you juxtapose down the line, and you decide more what's going to be easier for that, not necessarily easier, what's going to be more probable that we can, get, what position can we get? That is a big thing. So to your point, knowing that the O-line is very expensive and usually not the value, you're going to be looking in the draft that way. You're going to take other positions that you're more apt to find in the draft, not only in the, second, third, and fourth round, maybe in the fifth, sixth, and seventh round. You could find some running backs out there that can legitimately help you. Of course, you've gone over this before, and that is the truth as a general manager, along with the head coach. It's really trying to hone in on where you think you can get those picks, and where actually in the draft. If you know as a group, as an organization, that you need to get an O tackle, at that ninth pick, or then you obviously start thinking about, okay, how are we going to work our second, third, and fourth rounds? And you start looking at your scenarios that way, and you set up, again, multiple scenarios, which is really what, in the end, which is a perfect segue into Sumer Sports. Scenarios are huge. In this league, scenarios are very big. And you can't just in a remedial fashion, jump in and not be sort of thoughtful with it. You need to look at all the different opportunities. And in essence, and you can comment on this from a modeling standpoint, that's where we are with Sumer. It's something that we think can be really helpful for the general managers and head coaches.
Well, especially for teams that are rebuilding, right? And there's a couple things I'm going to write an article for the website, sumersports.com, by the way. Please check out our new website. We got an article tomorrow about restructures and sort of when to restructure and when not to restructure. I think it'll be pretty cool. But there's also this idea of, like, for teams that rebuild, rebuilding is not as hard as everybody believes, because the NFL is set up for you to have success, right? The NFL is set up for you to draft a quarterback, pay him hardly any money, build around him, much like the Bears did. And if you have success right out the gate, wonderful, right? Because then your fan base is in love with your team and all this kind of stuff. And if you struggle like the Bears did, you get the first pick and your fan base is still excited, right? And you get to do all this stuff. So I personally believe, for teams like Kansas City or teams like San Francisco, where, maybe they don't have as many moves, you can maybe make the infinite finite with those moves and those scenarios. But even for those teams, there's a lot of possible scenarios. And for teams like Carolina and Chicago, who are rebuilding, those scenarios are seemingly infinite, right? And I think that that's where mathematics can come in and really be a helper there. One of the interesting things, and again, this is a plug for analytics, plug for Sumer. We did, myself and Tage Seth, who's a data scientist with us at Sumer, when we were at Pro Football Focus, we wrote a paper about linebackers and how they bite on play action versus how they flow against the run. What's really fun was, I look back, and you can look at my Twitter account at @EricEager_. Roquan Smith did not fit the same mold when you look at the confluence of run, basically sitting back on play action versus being a little slower against the run, that Bobby Okereke and Darius Leonard did. But Tremaine Edmonds and the linebacker they also got, TJ Edwards, both do. So it was really a fun, like, when we're looking at trait-based analysis, stuff that's eventually going to go into our product, that was a really cool score, because obviously, your football eye, Thomas, and that of, guys like Matt Eberflus and so on, they can do that a lot. But the statistics can do it a million times, right? And so it's really cool to see what a smart football person prefers in a linebacker, and also what our data does. And that was a cool one to see in real time with the Bears signing of Edwards and of Edmonds.
So can we go back over to Carolina after, just to stay on this trade for a minute? So my feeling is, okay, so you have Ryan Poles in that situation, who's in a completely different situation. Now you have Scott Fitterer, he's 3 years in, right? Going into his fourth year. I believe it's the fourth already. And the pressure that's on him is much different, quite honestly, than the pressure that is on Frank Wright, as a new head coach coming into it. I mean, Scott, like I've told you all along, Scott is a good football man. He's got a very good eye, and he understands putting together rosters. He also has an owner who is very bullish on making sure, as we all are, right? We need to get the right quarterback. The pressure that is put on Scott Fitterer as a GM and the new quarterback that they ostensibly will take. Now they could move down, which I'd love to talk to you about as well. But if they did go with, one of the two quarterbacks that's being talked about out there, whether that's Young or whether that's Stroud, there are complications there. They're not, one happens to be 5'10" and a little bit, right? I don't care how good he is. That's still something to think about. I was reading something, I think it was through Peter King, who had mentioned that, I don't know, over the years that Frank has been a coach, it's very rare that he's ever played with a quarterback that's been under 6'4". So this is going to be something new for him if they do in fact go down the Alabama quarterback road. What I'm saying in the end here is, where Carolina is right now, moving on from two of their best top 5 players over the last few months, that's a big move for them organizationally. And of course, they have to have the confirmation and the assurance from an owner for Scott to make these very strong moves. I love where Scott is as a football person. Now he's going to be stepping into, what I have experienced and many of us have been experienced. There's a heat element there that's not always easy. And again, Scott's an even-keeled guy with a good football eye. This will be a really good time for him to step up and show the owner his worth.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that you bring up a really good point, right? You bring up a good point and when you look at this trade, I think the math, if you just look at averages, right? And some teams have the benefit of looking at the averages. Some teams don't, right? Some teams can play the long game. Some teams have to shoot for the moon, right? And in this particular case, and it's a little different, right? We're using PTJ's language here, but like the Bears sold the tail, meaning like if one of these quarterbacks comes out of the draft and they're a Patrick Mahomes type player, the Bears sold that. And the Panthers are buying the tail. But on average, when you look at surplus value, the Panthers gave up about $22 million per year in surplus value in this trade. And when you look at, the actual value, this is, a little bit, it's $142 million over the course of 4 years, which, is a decent amount there. And again, so I look at this and I'm thinking, okay, the Panthers should at least consider the idea that first overall pick is open for business, because there's no way, in my opinion, when you look at Stroud, who has his limitations, and you look at Young, which has his limitations, that you are that sure of that pick. Now, I can see why the Bears traded it right away, because, and you can speak to this a little bit more, having been somebody who's built a team a number of times. Them trading it now is taking away any doubt from people like me and people like you and people in the media and people talking heads or whatever that they're in on Justin Fields this year. Like that trade, they from the math standpoint, they got great value for it, and they tell their quarterback before free agency, we're going with you. That's the value of trading the pick. Now, for Carolina, the value is they could get more in return for this pick than the Bears got. And they should at least be open to that consideration.
Yeah, I mean, they're sitting here right now with almost a month away from the draft, being able to
more than a month.
More than a month. Yeah, for sure. Being able to field the calls, and that's a really important time for a general manager. Not only will they make calls, usually a general manager will have his loyalists take care of him and make the calls as well to try to see if there's any interest out there. Sometimes they can motivate media to do it. Sometimes there are so many different, avenues they can travel. What I think is really interesting, gives them an opportunity to spend more time together, head coach and general manager, to discuss the direction of, how they're going to set up the offense, which I think is fascinating as well, which leads, and we can talk more about, where we all are with Lamar. I get it. I mean, there are discussions there about teams who would move in that direction potentially would have to change their offense, right? So right now, I'm saying if the situation in Baltimore move towards Atlanta, I mean, they have a lot on their plate that way, right?
Yep.
I mean, to change an offense. But you also think the same thing. You have to build around a quarterback that you potentially will pick in the draft.
Yep.
Again, someone who's 5'10". That's very different than a system that they've been running for a while, at least in Indianapolis and beyond.
And this is where I want to talk about quarterback. We'll talk about the Jalen Ramsey trade maybe a different day. It's not that big of a deal. There's cool aspects of it, but let's talk about the quarterback position here, because again, and there are going to be a couple other, there are quarterbacks in free agency that we're going to talk about too, but you think about Bryce Young. Bryce Young has always had superstar talent around him at Alabama, right? He's had, Devontae Smith at times, or that Mac Jones and Devontae Smith, but he also had, Jamison Williams. He had Cameron Latu. He had the tight ends. He had the running backs. He had the offensive line. And yet at the same time, I think back for another guy, and he's actually the favorite right now. If you look at FanDuel and DraftKings, we don't talk betting a ton on this show, but if you look at the favorites in the market, it's CJ Stroud. And I think about CJ Stroud, okay? You've had Jackson Smith-Njigba for a time. You've had Marvin Harrison Jr., Marvin Harrison's son. Or you had Garrett Wilson for a time. You've had a number of great football players. And you had two tackles, both of whom had wingspans that would make, Charles Barkley blush. And now you're going to go to Carolina. In theory, you're like, let's say he's the first pick. You're going to go to a Carolina team who hasn't been good at tackle, right? Don't have any means to get one now. And they just traded their best wide receiver away and let go Robbie Anderson. His name's Chosen now, which we can get your opinion on that for a little bit. But so now CJ Stroud's going to go from one and in the Big Ten, and you can talk about this too as a guy who used to scout. You're always an athletic mismatch in that conference. When your receivers are going up against Northwestern, Minnesota, Nebraska, Wisconsin, you're always more athletic than they are. You go to Carolina, and they've traded away your means, right? I think it's a good question is does Carolina tip their hand in trading away the supporting cast? Do they want a quarterback who's more supporting cast independent than somebody like CJ Stroud?
Wow. I mean, those are great points and great questions. And you start pinpointing the issues that may be out there, which let's backtrack for a minute. You watch Daniel Jeremiah give his spiel on CJ Stroud, right? The fluidity and the smoothness. And I'm all for DJ knows what he's talking about. If you guys ever want someone who knows about evaluating, he and Bucky Brooks are really good. They're great guys to follow. DJ was talking about that. And I thought, yeah, okay. Just what you said. However, it's easy to be smooth when you have what you just described, right? That's a great spot to be in. And then, you flip it over to what you're talking about, with Bryce Young. I mean, what I'm saying here, this is not an easy situation. And oh, by the way, I also hear that Frank Reich is a big fan of a Gator quarterback that we all know that has risen to the top fast. And some people are even talking about him being the number one. Look, I love his athleticism.
He's more likely to be the number one pick per FanDuel than, and I know you're on Kay's show on that network, which is cool. We'll put a link to that on SumerSports.com. Anthony Richardson's more likely, at least the last time I looked at the odds, to be the number one pick than Bryce Young. And I can kind of see it. Here's why. And he had accuracy issues, but you watch some of his good games. There's a lot of drops. There's a lot of bad O-line play. There's a lot of stuff he's going to have to put up with when whoever goes to Carolina. So he makes you wonder a little bit, right? It makes you look. And I got to say, as somebody
– doesn't make me wonder. I would never, ever – I'm just saying, I love his athletes. I love athletes. I love movement. Yep. I think they're difference makers. And I get what you're saying. I'm not trying to be naysayer here.
But let's talk QB evaluate, because you obviously you batted 1,000 in your career. Your first draft pick was Matt Ryan, and he's a Hall of Fame player and MVP all under your watch. And obviously he's a bigger guy, not unathletic, by the way. I think a lot of people look at the end of his career and they're like, oh, he's a statue. No, I think he was a fairly good athlete, especially when he was younger. Very accurate, very, very cerebral. And so very natural to be that draft pick, right? And there was a guy who was later in his draft, Joe Flacco, who was more the Anthony Richardson side, but big hawking thing, not as fast, but certainly more athletic than Matt Ryan was, but raw. And do you think, let's turn the clock back a little bit. If you were the Ravens general manager in 2008, right, coming off of a bad season where they said Brian Billick was safe, and then they lost to the 1-15 Dolphins. So then they fire Brian Billick, and then they go with John Harbaugh, who's still there. Yep. If you're picking top three, I sort of agree with you. The Anthony Richardson thing's a bridge too far because that guy's playing right away. But if you're picking like 10 to 12 to 15, do you then consider a guy who is toolsy, but you have to squint to see the NFL production? Is that where you're more looking like, or is that a guy who's just a later round pick for you because of accuracy issues and the like?
So I would say you have to squint a little bit. I do agree with you more in that 8 to 12. I don't know if you'll even sniff that part of the draft, right? I think it's going to happen earlier. Yeah. Someone's going to take the shot at it. But then you look at Seattle, what they just did. Are they the prime team to have someone come in there and wait in the wings for 1 or 2 years? And is this the ideal situation for him to be there? Look, from an evaluation standpoint, there are many, many things that you want in a quarterback, of course, right? We can start from the ability to get away from the pocket, the ability to move in the pocket, which I mentioned to you guys before. And I think I mentioned quite outspoken. I was quite outspoken about it when I got fired a couple years ago. And I said, look, towards the end, as much as I love Matt Ryan and appreciate everything we did together, there was a time at the end of my career where I started thinking the next time around, wasn't saying cut Matt at all. I was saying the next time around, if I ever got an opportunity, I would love to have someone with that much more mobility to see how it was to game break that way. Matt did wonderful things for us, of course, but that athletic quarterback is enticing. When you look at these guys, especially the special ones who can rip off 75 and 80-yard runs, you do daydream. And you daydream whether you're in your office watching some other position and you're daydreaming this time of the draft, whether you're on the treadmill or the Stairmaster sweating, you're thinking about it. When you go home at night, you're thinking about it, right? Who would be the ideal person to help a young quarterback like this? When you listen and you read the quotes that the head coach from the University of Florida, why am I blanking?
Billy Napier.
Not Bill. Yes, Napier. He had mentioned his comments were positive, but he was also really stressing not that he's the guy all the way. He was saying he's still growing, he's still learning, he works really, really hard. These are all really interesting comments that aren't oozing with like he's the dude, you take him at 1 and don't look back, which I find very interesting.
Yeah, it's incredible, right? Because you also have guys who it's so weird, right? Because let's talk a little bit about your process, because I think about Mahomes, right? And that's going to be the classic comparison because he can flick the ball as well as he can and all this movement stuff. He's actually a better athlete than if you adjust for size than guys like Fields and like Lamar, because he's a hawk. But the issue is like you don't have those next few years. And maybe that's what's in Napier's in his voice, which is Mahomes had a year where he only completed 55% of his passes. But then he stayed for 2 more years and threw the ball around the yard. So you saw that development. And at the same time, at the other end, you had a guy like Drew Lock out of Missouri who 2 straight years couldn't hit the broadside of a barn, then got better, but then he got in the NFL and a lot of the accuracy issues go away or have come back in large part for him. So it's interesting because and you have a guy like Trey Lance, right? Where Trey Lance was at North Dakota State. Trey Lance threw something like, I can't remember the exact number, but like 50 passes when trailing at NDSU. So not only do you have the issue of not playing top competition, but you also don't play in a lot of tough situations. And Tage said, the aforementioned, there's a great article on sumersports.com called "What is the Mid-Range Jump Shot of the NFL?" And I think of it as, okay, it's 3rd down and 7. You're down by 7. The whole stadium knows you're throwing. You can't run play action. You can't run a screen. You can't do anything that helps the quarterback. You got to hit a pass, right? You got to go 1, 2, 3 and hit a comeback or a curl or a slant or a post or something to get your team a first down when everybody in the stadium knows you're throwing, right? And I think for some of these, I think for a guy like Anthony Richardson, he can't go to a team where they make him have that all the time, right? He's got to go to a Detroit that's got a great offensive line and a great running game and a great play caller, and you're not in 3rd and 7 a lot, right? you've got to go to a place, frankly, like Kansas City, where you're not in 3rd and 7 a lot. And like those places are hard to come by because the teams that fall in love with his ability are picking in the top 5, and they're picking in the top 5 because they don't have the infrastructure to, generally speaking, give you those, sort of layups or corner threes in the parlance of basketball for the QB position.
So when we start thinking about evaluating the quarterback and we talk about it just from snap to whistle, and the idea, as I said, getting away from the center if they are in fact taking, the snap, which, will be interesting to see how that plays out with someone, in a situation like this. The idea of mechanics, Eric, the idea of the strength of the zip of the ball, the strength of the ball. If someone has a big gun, we used to think, wow, if he has a big gun, I don't care if he's a crappy leader or not, he can manage everything, he can run, he can do all this stuff. We've seen some really good athletes with big guns who have had up and down careers, and some of them have been really good for a while and then have plummeted for other reasons. When you are putting together your evaluation and your pitch to an owner on your quarterback, you do want some of this, right? You want there to be consistency in your quarterback. Yep. You want him, quite honestly, I remember learning this, and I learned a lot of this from Bill Belichick as well. I mean, the idea of having a quarterback that doesn't necessarily need a gun for everyone out there, and I'm sure most people know that now. The accuracy, the awareness in the pocket, the awareness and the ability to move in the pocket doesn't necessarily need to mean you have to run a 4-4-2 or whatever it is. It means you have to have the awareness to step up, adjust, throw off balance, do whatever you need to do to survive within the pocket and have a great awareness. You, of course, have to have a legitimate enough O-line that's going to keep your ability to step up in the pocket. When Matt Ryan struggled the most is when we didn't allow him as an offensive line to step up in the pocket. He could do, interestingly enough, he could deal with some of this stuff on the periphery. It's when that rush was coming in heavy-handed, that was tough. So what I would say is that ability to stand tall, if you are a stand tall quarterback, or the ability to move and have the eyes and the awareness is really good to be able to, function at all different levels to be able to throw that ball. That's part of it, of course, and there's so much nuance to it. I don't ever want to say that we wouldn't be sitting here talking for hours about the nuance of quarterback specifics. You can get any of the experts out there. There's so much to it. I want to hit some of the big ideas because, look, you're not winning a Super Bowl with someone who does not have the consistency. The up and down elements of quarterbacks, no way. The ones that don't have the leadership, no way. The ones that don't have the accuracy that we're looking for, no way. You might have quarterbacks, and I'll let you go, that might not look that great with their delivery. And all the experts out there are going to try to adjust and work on the delivery, which we all love, that pretty throwing motion. That said, the results need to be what I just mentioned. You're not just thriving off of this athletic guy who moves around and wows the crowd.
Yeah, for sure. And I think accuracy is such an interesting trait, right? Because you can measure it with statistics, and there's a really good, metric that called completion percentage over expected, which kind of looks at, how deep the throw is and how difficult it is, and looks at what your completion percentage is above and beyond that. But there's also, it's also, you have to look at what's going to be consistent, right? And as like I actually wrote this as part of my book, which is like, Matt Ryan in 2016 on throws 20 yards down the field or more was the most accurate quarterback, or one of the top 5 in the league. And then in 2017, it wasn't as accurate. Well, why was that? Well, because you had receivers that performed better in 2016 than you did in 2017. A lot of deep ball accuracy is actually how good the wide receivers on the team track the football. And so you can look at guys who have, Zach Wilson and BYU in 2020 has a great year throwing the ball deep. And we all say, oh, he's got a rubber arm. It's like, do we actually go back and say, well, is that deep ball accuracy real, or is it more ball tracking by the receivers? Or if a guy struggles with deep passes, is that because he's actually bad at that? Or could it be that the wide receivers let him down for a season? Those are things, when you think about consistency, I think about, statistically, we have to look at data that is consistent. And for quarterbacks, it's always going to be, how good is he without play action? How good is he in a clean pocket? And how good is he, when, in third down and, sort of in money downs, right? Like when everybody knows he's throwing, you can evaluate quarterbacks on a whole nother spectrum, because once you throw in pressure, well, it's like, well, do your wide receivers win? right? When you throw in things like play action, it's like, well, how much does the other team respect your running back? You start to throw in data that isn't characteristic to the QB, right? And so statistically, you have to take into consideration, you have to level the playing field, which makes it really hard because now you're only looking at 200 to 300 passing attempts per quarterback per season. But those are the data points you have to look at. You have to level the playing field so that you can measure not only the consistency, but also just the accuracy and the timing and all that for quarterbacks, which is essential for winning in the NFL, as you said.
It's great leveling the playing field. Completely agree. When I sit there and I think about leveling the playing field as well, so statistics aside for a minute, it always comes back to that for me, only to keep it real, that the importance of, we've said this in a number of different podcasts, you have that quarterback there that has the resiliency, the moxie, the toughness to not only take a hit, but get up when it becomes really, when it becomes nut cutting time. Let's just use that phrase. I'm sorry if it's the wrong phrase to use, but when it becomes that time, that quarterback has to be in it. He has to be in it to win it in the end. He has to have toughness about him. He has to be able to have mental and physical toughness about him. And if he doesn't have that, again, I don't care how big he is, how strong he is, and all the other elements. For me, it's the same with, technique. You can be working on all of that technique, right? As scouts, we have our guys analyze the movement, et cetera, et cetera. But we also have the scouts. When you start talking about quarterbacks, it is so important that you research everything about that quarterback. I mentioned it the other day. The benchmark is so high for quarterbacks, right? Where, there might be other positions where, okay, his test score can be here, his whatever it is, his ability to understand the game, his awareness could be here. Everything is ratcheted up for a quarterback because we know how important that is. Yeah. So in the end, there's not just one element. There are so many facets to really hone in to get that quarterback. So when you are picking number 1 overall and you trade away the house like Carolina did, there is a lot to be worked on over the next few months.
Can you tell me a little bit then about preferences, right? Because I think that there, so we've both talked about Anthony Richardson. I like him as a prospect for a team like Detroit, for a team like Seattle, for a team that can sit him, and for whom, like you think about, I'm going to bring it back, right? I'm going to bring it back to the day. The Bears drafted Jim Harbaugh when they had Jim McMahon, right? The Denver Broncos drafted Tommy Maddox in the first round when they had John Elway, right? The Niners drafted Jim Druckenmiller when Steve Young was on the team. All of this stuff. We used to see this. We used to see quarterbacks sit and just be used as insurance policies. But for the most part, that doesn't happen anymore, right? When you take a guy top 5, he's going to play pretty soon. And even you think about Mahomes got drafted by the Chiefs. Alex Smith led the league in passer rating when Mahomes is sitting on the bench, and they traded him to Washington the next year. Like, there is always the expectation there. Do you ever see, when you're taking a guy high, let's say top 10, does that guy have to be a ceiling guy? Because ceiling guys you got to be able to bail from them if they suck. And there's a good chance that the guy comes out of the box and he's Zach Wilson, and it's just, you're done, right? Or, and by the way, I don't think that makes Joe Douglas a bad drafter. Sometimes the cards flip over and they suck. And that doesn't mean anything other than it just happened. Like, I personally think that we attribute too much. You always talk about your defensive ends and stuff. It's like sometimes the guy comes out of the box and it's not good, right? And that doesn't mean you're a bad evaluator. And so if you take a high ceiling guy, you got to be able to bail on the guy quickly, right? And you got to be able to have plan B. And I know it sucks. And so do you prefer in the top 10 a guy with more of a high floor, a guy that you at least know that worst case scenario, this guy's going to be a halfway decent NFL quarterback, even if the ceiling isn't as high? Like, how do you balance those two things?
Look, this is completely, in my mind, contingent on the organization, which is led by the guy whose train said it is. And I've said that time and again. Your owner is going to dictate how you approach this. As much as GMs and head coaches don't want to admit it when they get in there, they won't admit it to the media. You're always going to have that knock on the door or the proverbial hanging over your head. I say that respectfully, of an owner saying, You're drafting the 3rd overall pick, and we are 4 wins in. You're damn right I'm expecting you to play this guy, and I'm expecting you to play him now. That's why I brought you in. And look, there is no question about that. When we brought in Matt Ryan, we were playing him from the get-go. We were going to be creative. We had Mike Mularkey. We had a group in there that had a good understanding of offense. It's when we brought in Michael Turner. It doesn't really matter who they are. You look at any organization out there, if your owner has a thumb on you and the owner is not saying, look, you have 3, 5, 7 years. No, that is not today's world. That's why more and more of these GMs and head coaches know we have to get on the train now with this guy, even if it's not great in year 1 or potentially 2. I mean, here's Chicago. They had to play Fields in my mind. They have to see what they have. They have to develop him. And you can't sit there as a general manager and a head coach say, I have 3, 4 years. You don't. In today's world, you do not. It is more not for long than ever. And that's why. But what is incumbent on you as the team builders, as head coach, is put him in the right position, get creative with him so that he can truly develop. Surround him with the right people. Right, Bill Polian was my sort of go-to guy when I watched how he built around Peyton Manning, and I thought there is nothing more that I'm going to do than make sure that I surround Matt Ryan. And I will say this categorically, respectfully to Matt Ryan, if you look at our acquisitions, and I was criticized for it, we spent a lot of time and money on putting people around Matt. Matt never went without receivers, tight ends. Running backs towards the end, of course, I wish we would have done a better job. But we supplied him with pretty much all.
He had Roddy White when he got there. Michael Jenkins was a 1st-round pick. We ran a 4.7, but whatever. He was a 1st-round pick. You had Brian. Speaking of running 4.7s, you had Brian Finneran on the team. You had players who had played in the league before, to your point. And then you got Tony Gonzalez, then you got Julio Jones, then you got Calvin Ridley. You really did. And I think in many ways, if you erred, and this is where I really like what Ryan Poles did in Chicago, if you erred on having offense. Kansas City, that 2018 Chiefs team had one of the worst defenses I've ever seen play in a conference title game. And they still played in a conference title game because the quarterback was good enough. When you guys started to struggle on defense, it's because your guys got slow and old and like all that stuff. And then, once Matt, and once you got, and this is the other part, once you got the force multiplier of Kyle Shanahan in there, you hit on a couple drafts with Beasley for a while and Jones and Campbell and Alua kind of, and like that kind of helped you guys get to the Super Bowl, but you do have to put offense in place because defense is just too variable year to year. It's too dependent on injuries. You just can't gamble too much on defense and you need to have offense.
So think about this. We had 2 of the best defensive coordinators come in to be our head coach, Mike Smith at first and then Dan Quinn. And people often say, how did you convince those guys to go offense? They were at the front of the door or, knocking on my door, as far as acquisition, saying like, I know what it takes to defend that really good quarterback and that really good offense. So they get in that mode when they become the head coach and they realize that they have to have the right players in those positions. Look, we talked about it so many times about having badass defenses. That's all I've ever wanted. I never had an opportunity to really build that. Hindsight, who knows how we would have adjusted it, but it's complicated.
You won a lot of games though. Like the thing is like defense is, was the Chiefs defense good this year? No, they gave up 35 points in the Super Bowl, but like the quarterbacks, the quarterback is king in this league, right? Like, even the year, like I think in 2017, and granted they lost the Super Bowl that year, but the Patriots had one of the worst defensive starts I've ever seen of a team. And they eventually coaching figures it out. Obviously Bill's the best of all time, but like coaching but you can't coach. You can coach a defense to be good over time. You can like quarterbacks. And this is a state, offenses that are elite, they go through the NFL season working through their problems, right? You always look at Brady, like I remember that the 2013, it was like a game they won like 13-6 against the Jets on Thursday Night Football. Just terrible football game. He's out here just cussing out his wide receivers. Something like Aaron Dobson and guys you've never heard of. And he's trying to win with those guys. But you know what? By the time it got to November, some of those receivers had figured it out, right? Because the elite teams battle through their problems. And the teams that are not quite elite, they spend the regular season hiding their problems. And the teams that try to hide their quarterback for a whole year, what happens in the playoffs? They get figured out. It's why like guys like Jimmy G never win Super Bowls. It's why guys like Kirk Cousins, because the Dan Quinns of the world, they're licking their chops when they get a playoff game against Kirk Cousins or Jimmy G or Derek Carr or something like that. Because and so that's the other part. It's like, if you really want to win a Super Bowl, your quarterback's got to be a guy that when that matchup happens with Tom Brady, Ben Roethlisberger, Patrick, he's at Justin Herbert, he's at least not an embarrassing mismatch in that matchup. Am I right? Like that's how you have to build a football team.
You're exactly right. No, you're exactly right. And I know we're almost to the end of this today, but when we continue to talk about the matchups on that offense and making sure you're surrounding your quarterback with all you need, not of course just the skill positions. I mean, along your offensive line as well. I have said this a number of times. I don't want to leave this conversation with what I think is a very vital part. I've mentioned leadership. Of course, it gets old for people. I understand that. I do want to continue to mention, though, it's not just the leading of the running backs and the receivers. I know it's a broken record. It's when you have that quarterback who can lead the entire team. He can lead the defense. The defense wants to follow him. He has, again, that moxie and that confidence about him that people want to get behind, whether he's injured or not. I mean, Matt Ryan, I just use him as an example, 1.5 games injured his entire 14 years at the Falcons. Like, that's pretty amazing. You start to gain more and more confidence of a defense, whether they've been there or not. People talk about that. So I just think that having the whole team is important, because that also means the coaches are behind you. So when the coaches are in their defensive room and they're not just poo-pooing or rolling their eyes at the quarterback, this guy's a pain, blah, 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 this guy's not doing things, they're behind him.
Right. We talk about leadership all the time, even in business, right? Like it's sort of this thing where it can cover, like, I make fun of Jimmy G, but I honestly think Jimmy G was somebody that the Niners loved playing with and loved playing for. I think leadership can take you from a 5 out of 10 to a 7 out of 10, which is good enough in the case of the Niners to have winning seasons. I think leadership, you look at, and again, I talk about Mahomes. I mean, I'm not bashful about this. He's the best player in football. But when you look at a guy who is on one leg, like during the playoffs, and he's willing to run for a first down in both the AFC Championship game and then the Super Bowl, while, in all essence, he's working on an injury that's a 4 to 6 week injury. The whole team looks at him and they're like, I got to play for him, right? We talk about Troy Aikman. Like, when Troy Aikman walked into the huddle and took a knee, Michael Irvin shut the hell up, and Michael Irvin never shuts up, right? Like, when you have a quarterback that can lead, it takes you from an 8 to a 10. It takes you from a 5 to a 7. And I even think for some of these guys, some of these backups who aren't very good, like think about Chad Henne or think about, guys who are not talented backups anymore, but when they have some leadership to them, the guys rally around the backup quarterback for a little bit. So I think it takes every quarterback up a notch when he has leadership ability.
It's a great way to articulate it. And so let's flip it over to a guy like Marcus Mariota. By the way, a great guy, one of the best souls in our league. Everyone loves him. What he did by leaving the way that he did, that's a game breaker in a different way, right? It's a really, really complicated situation. I don't know how much longer he wants to play in the NFL, but can you imagine being on the team that he goes to next after having left?
But take Derek Carr. Derek Carr gets benched, and like rightfully so, because of the contract, because of the Raiders don't want to like lose out on a possible trade, and he goes home. Like, there's something about like, and again, Matt Ryan is, obviously like a very venerable quarterback. There's something about an older quarterback who loses a job that still is on the sideline wearing the C. And he's just like, I'm still going to lead this team, even though I'm not good enough to be the starter anymore. There's still something about that guy where he's an honorable, venerable player for your team. And granted, Mariota had to get a knee surgery and all this stuff, but still, you got to be with the team. Like, there's always, and as somebody who played, there's always something better about a guy who's injured and out for the season that's traveling with the team and doing those kind of things than the guy who kind of pieces out and says, I'll be back next year. I got to take my classes or something like that. Like, and it's not fair, but it's the way it works.
Some of this, though, and I have a lot of really, really good agent friends. Please, let's not mistake that. It is on the agent to make sure that they work together and talk about it. An agent can dissuade or persuade, hands down. That's why they're there for them too, right? To be beside them along the way. And for an agent to ever persuade their guy to do that, I'm not saying we can't pin that on them all the time, but it is an important part of an agent to make sure they're working with their player. To your point, I mean, I'm not saying maybe it is old school, maybe it's not. To be especially the quarterback and not be there to the very end, of course, unless you're working on something rehabbing, that is imperative that you're out of the building. But man, I just have never believed in that. That may sound a little old school, but it is the way it is. And it comes back to leadership. It comes back to who do these guys want to follow? And if they're following a guy that's going to take the shots year in, day in, whatever, year in, year out, and steps up and continues to be competitive. It's why I have a massive amount of respect for guys like Matt Ryan, who at times maybe people thought should have moved on, but he hung out and he just got up, literally and figuratively speaking. So don't ever let that out of your mind. Any of you rising executives, it's easy to go for the athlete. It's easy to go for the big arm and all of this stuff that's going to keep you in the game. But if you don't have the leader, man, I've seen way too many players over the years that didn't have the leadership ability and they fizzled.
Well, let's summarize a little bit, because I want to, this show has been great as far as we've gone through every position now. And if you want to look at, they're on our YouTube page. We actually tweeted them out in order. I'm gonna lay it bare here. This is the position for which analytics offers the least, in my opinion, quarterback, because for a number of different reasons. And the sample size is way too low, right? We get 4 to 7 guys a year coming through the draft that ever will play. Right. So you just don't get a big, we're going to get tons of pass rushers coming off the edge every year. And we're going to get to sharpen our models. And the nature of what is a pass rusher doesn't change that much. The second part to that point is quarterbacks, being a quarterback has changed so much since, for the last 10 years. And there's so little turnover at the position that the league's evolution, along with the data evolution, has happened so fast with so few players actually undergoing it that saying anything definitive statistically is incredibly hard. So at this position, right? At this position, I think in data, what you really want to look for are eliminators, right? So things like if a guy, things that are a non-starter at QB, and even those you want to relent on, right? Don't draft a guy over 6 feet. Well, Kyler Murray's had success in the NFL. Don't draft a guy who isn't accurate in college. Well, Josh Allen's had success in the NFL. So even then, you gotta be a little bit lenient and a little bit humble about these things. But analytics offers the least at quarterback than any other position in the NFL, in my opinion, from college to pro. And I think that this is where obviously scouting and where our job at Sumer Sports to derive these new metrics, it is the biggest field. It is the biggest gold mine, because if you can uncover one quarterback per off season, you are going to win the arms race of analytics in the NFL, because this, in my opinion, we've offered the least so far at the position among all of them so far in the history of sports analytics.
I think that was an appropriate bomb that you just dropped, because it's so true. And I say that bomb wise. I'm saying most people would think, wow, we're gonna figure out the quarterback position through data, and there's a lot, like you just said, and I love that for the owners like David Tepper to look and say, look, there is a lot of information out there that we haven't tapped into that we can. And there's a gold mine out there. I love that idea. And I would say that to my contemporaries as general managers. Don't just kind of wing it. And there is so much there that you can tap into. I think I just saw.
Yeah, right. Mojo, really good quote. Joe Burrow has small hands. Tua Tagovailoa was one of the most efficient passers that's ever played, right?
Yeah, but he's now taking jujitsu, so he knows how to fall, so he doesn't concuss.
But if you look at and there's a tweet out there. I whenever I give a lecture to a university, I always put my own tweet where I said, I'm watching the Rose Bowl. I'm probably $1,000 deep on Oregon, right? I'm tilting my mind off. I throw out a tweet, Justin Herbert's not a first-round pick. And by the way, they did cover, but they covered because of a few turnovers. Justin Herbert was horrendous in that game. And yet he comes in the league, and from day one, he's brilliant, right? There are confounder upon confounders upon confounders at this position that I think even the most rigorous statistical analyses, which my team at PFF was trying to do, we at Sumer Sports are trying to do, all this kind of stuff, is still going to miss. And we obviously, that doesn't mean to give up. That doesn't mean to just bow down to what I would say to be like more subjective analysis. But what it means is that we got to go back to the drawing board constantly at this position, because I don't think we have it figured out. And those misses are costing these teams. I mean, if the Panthers do not hit on this pick, it is I'm going to look at this right now, $142 million mistake, right? Per this trade, right? And if they hit on it, it doesn't matter how much this pick costs, right? Like, no, does anybody remember who the Bills got with the trade for Mahomes? The Bills got Tre'Davious White, one of the best defensive players in the NFL. No one gives a shit, because the quarterback that the Chiefs got is worth everything now, right? And so, like, if you can make that more scientific, if it's possible, there's tons of bounty to be made there.
So think of everything you're talking about. We get fired up, right? Anyone who has passion for football gets fired up for this conversation. Now, take it to another level, okay? You've already accomplished your discussion with the owner and how you're going to put this team together and the head coach. Now you have to deal with the offensive coordinator, and you have to deal with the quarterback coach and maybe the receiver coach. These are other levels that you're thinking, well, that has nothing to do with us as a team builder, as the evaluator. Yes, it does. All of a sudden, these guys aren't adept at what they're doing for some reason or another, or they don't have the right system. They don't put their quarterbacks in the right place to thrive. All of a sudden, you have a curve that's a little bit of a wah-wah curve. Before you know it, years go by, and you haven't really tapped into the ability, because you have not been creative as a play caller or as a scheme builder. And your guy in the meeting room is not operating the way he should. This is a whole other topic that is complicated. It's a ongoing issue and discussion point and bone of contention between an owner, a head coach, and a GM. It forever has been there.
Yeah, it takes a village to raise a quarterback. I'm just like, that's probably the best way to put it. And organizationally, like I talk about Mahomes, but like organizationally, the Chiefs have been one of the more stable organizations in all of football. You look at the quarterback that, and I'm going to, you are a part of this, the quarterback that has improved the most in the history of the NFL from day one to day end is Tom Brady. Tom Brady was a game manager quarterback who became the best player in the history of the league. And what was a staple of New England Patriots was organizational stability. Like, you need that. And one thing, and I'm going to say this about the Panthers, Frank Reich, anybody I've talked to in the league, they love Frank Reich. They're building a great staff there. Obviously, they have ownership's backing. To me, that's a huge feather in the cap for whomever they draft. There's a chance that person at least has a chance, because there's organizational stability that is unlike some of these other teams that have just signed a coach.
Yes.
Yeah.
I love it. No, you're exactly right. Organizational stability, Frank Reich, and you're talking about Scott Fitterer being able to work together, because that is really important. Let me throw you a really zinger question. Let's see. Put your big brain to work on this. You have your analytics on the side there. You're ready to start calculating. But let me ask you this question. You mentioned a couple minutes ago that it takes a village to raise, as I had, as far as a quarterback. Let's just say you had the ideal quarterback, but that quarterback was extra. You like to use that word, extra, but he was very, very talented. But being extra, whether it was a young guy or whether it was a veteran, you knew that you had to supply extra ability for him or extra work. You needed a massage therapist. You needed someone that was going to coach him along the way, mental coach. You also needed someone that was going to get him to the building on time, figuratively and literally speaking, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Would you do that and all that comes with it if you thought he had a chance to be a Super Bowl quarterback? Where do you draw that line? This is a complicated question, because I want to fold in the complications of this. And the reason I bring this up, it's fantasy, yes, but I have gone back and forth over the years to wonder, would I truly do that and throw a major twist into the organization? This is a small part, and I don't want to start digging up bones on Russell Wilson. The office at the building, the extra people at the building. Would you do that in a situation, or would you completely avoid that?
So if I already had the quarterback and then I found out he was extra, I would do whatever it took, because you already have made that commitment. It's way too expensive to bail.
Would you do that? Wait a minute. Sorry, I have to do this. You say that, and then all of a sudden there's unrest in the locker room. That pain in the ass is turning the building upside down. You realize how good he can be as a GM. Your head coach does, and yet there's more and more churning within that building. Would you still do it?
I would. No. I wouldn't opt into that situation. If I knew a priori that the guy was high maintenance like that, I would prefer a guy who maybe was a little bit worse that I could develop, because also that person's not going to develop that well. Like the thing, and maybe I'm generalizing, I could be wrong, but like what I want in a quarterback is Tom Brady had the best growth mindset of any player that's ever played sports, right? Like he had a weak arm at the beginning of his time with, and through whatever, like, learning how to torque, learning how to like train himself, he was extra to himself, not to anybody. Like he didn't impose that way. And obviously the Alex Guerrero thing and all that kind of got a little dicey, right? But like he certainly was more than worth it, right? You'd have to make the calculation. But like, as we said on the last show, once the offensive lineman, and when I was in college, I hope this guy doesn't listen to the podcast, but our offensive coordinator was so bad my senior year that every time we came off on the sideline, everyone was bitching about the play call. And I look at the left guard, I'm like, my brother in Christ, you got your ass kicked on that play. Stop talking about the play call. Like, but when you have a leader, whether that be the coordinator or the quarterback, who isn't doing their job or is high maintenance or is just questionable in any way, then every other player starts to point fingers as opposed to looking at their own execution. And once you have that, it's over, right? Like like I played with the conference player of the year my senior year in college, NSIC, the same conference as Adam Thielen. And we weren't that good because of that dynamic, where every time we had a 3 and out, everybody was complaining about somebody else. If you have an offensive coordinator or quarterback for whom that ends up being true, you got to bail. And it's hard to turn it around. It's hard because you basically got to get a whole new squad, because once somebody has turned on you mentally, it's really hard to get them back. So I would say I would err on the side of somebody who's more mentally tough than somebody who's maybe a little extra. But that's a tough, because like Brett Favre was extra, right? Like, and Andy Reid was really good with him. And, Jeff George was extra. That's another example of a guy with a cannon for an arm who, professionally and personally wasn't there. And so he could never win. His win percentage was like 38%. You wonder why. Really talented guy, but could never, he went from being a bust to being transient in the league the rest of the time because of just what you said. He can come in, give you a spark, but eventually, you prefer somebody else.
It's a really hot conversation. I think that happens in our rooms, just so everyone understands that. You have that conversation, whether it's with the scouting staff, whether it's with the coaches and coaching staff, or whether it's with your owner as well. You have to be realistic about what you have, and you also have to be realistic about how your organization is set up. Some might be able to handle, what Denver might have done as far as, having an office for Russell or whatever it may be. That to me seems a lot more manageable than the big picture one, right? Where you're doing everything in your power to walk around literally and figuratively with this guy. It's so high maintenance. That's a complicated deal, because you have a lot of people who are, I don't know if it's jealous or just resentful of the time that's being put into this guy. And we've seen,
and that guy can be a wide receiver. That guy can be Antonio. That guy can be Randy
Yes.
Moss. He can be Antonio Brown or Antonio. Like, because my buddy Bruce, who played for the Pittsburgh Steelers, was like, it was a chore to get that dude at the stadium every single week. And the reason that guy can be a wide receiver and not be the quarterback is because the quarterback can go over to the left guard who's talking mess about this wide receiver and say, he helps us win, shut the hell up. Like that's the leadership component. And, when you have, like, here's another part. A guy doesn't act like Russell Wilson. Like, Russell Wilson doesn't have an office now, right? Because his head coach is an alpha, right? The reason Russell Wilson can walk all over Nathaniel Hackett, because Nathaniel Hackett didn't have the career capital to walk up to some of those Denver Broncos veterans and be like, hey, Russell helps us win, shut the hell up. Like, there's an aspect of that too, where the coach has to, if the quarterback is extra, the coach has got to be able to battle for him. both guys can't be questionable in that realm. But also, your quarterback really can't be questionable either, because there are going to be other dudes. You cannot build a football team with choir boys, right? And there are going to be other dudes on the team that are high maintenance, and you'd rather those guys be a guy the quarterback can vouch for because they help you win than a guy that guy be the quarterback.
Well, so I know we're way over time here, but this is such a fascinating conversation. Let me just finish off with George Payton for a minute, the GM from the Broncos. So that was an organizational decision. I'm not totally putting that on George at all. And it doesn't really matter whether George can say, I wanted to do it the way I wanted to do it, and what we thought was the best for the organization at the time, given Nathaniel Hackett's, lack of experience. So that's not even, I'm not even throwing in any way any sort of derogatory comments towards George on it. I know personally, I was faced with that with Mike Smith when we decided in that final year to let Tony Gonzalez leave the building and stay out for training camp, right? And it came back to haunt us. We always wondered, and Tony's awesome, but there were a lot of people within the community, the fan base, et cetera, because we didn't do real well that year. I believe that was 15, I think. We didn't, it was something that became an issue for the organization. And we all wondered, should we have done that or not? My feeling was always, well, if Tony's going to come back or not come back, I'd rather him come back and not come to training camp than if we're not going to allow him to not come back to training camp or not play, then I would go with that direction. That's what direction I did. I wonder if George, with the same situation, if it was knocked on the door, did he have to make a decision that was right there, yay or nay, to get this guy, which evidently could have been the case. So I'm just saying, in the end, a GM has a lot on his plate, and I'm not just sticking up for the GMs. Same with head coaches. There's a lot of nuanced decisions. Ultimately, that's how you're judged, by those really difficult decisions.
Yeah, for sure. And like I said, this is where I think analytics can help the least right now, because we don't have all the personal aspects of it. We don't have, the parts that, people like, I have one of my best friends, Seren Petro, thinks that Troy Aikman's one of the most overrated Hall of Famers of all time. And I'm like, there's a little bit more than just his stats when he played for the Cowboys. I'll tell you that much. There's aspects of his game that I don't know if we're really counting when we just look at Pro Football Reference. But anyway, that's a digression. This was a lot of fun. This is a great conversation. I can't wait to have one tomorrow. Tomorrow we'll be at 7 Eastern. We'll be right back here where we were. We're going to talk more about the moves of the day. We're going to take some notes. We're going to, put some analytics to all these names. There were moves that happened while we were working on this show. Hopefully it'll slow down a little bit tomorrow so we can catch our breath and talk about them. And then we will be in person Wednesday. This is a great conversation, Thomas. It's always cool. I just love being able to just bounce these off, with you, and then also the folks in the comments. By the way, if you are watching this live, please subscribe, rate, and review. If you are on YouTube, please hit the like button. If you are on iTunes or Spotify or one of the podcast platforms, please write a review, give the thumbs up, all that good stuff. Subscribe to us, and give our Twitter page at Sumer Sports a follow as well for all this great content. We're only going to get better from here. So we really appreciate you following along with us. So for Thomas Mitrov, this has been Eric Eager. This has been the Sumer Sports Show.